Some of what's been happening on the diplomatic front more broadly between Iran, countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, how that fits into everything happening in West Asia now. We are very, very honored to be joined once again here by Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics. Giorgio, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be with you guys.
Well, great to have you here to sort through all of this. And I guess the first question I want to ask you is, we've seen a lot of Iranian sort of diplomacy in the sense people, I'm sure, have seen the foreign minister flying around to different countries. And I wonder, what you think their overall strategy is in approaching many of these Gulf states with the sort of Damocles sword of the Israeli response to their missile attacks happening, and how are you viewing the response we've seen from some of the GCC countries that they've been engaging with?
Yeah, good question. So obviously on the 1st of this month, we had the two-wave ballistic missile attack that Iran carried out against Israel. And for the past 16 days, the Iranians have been preparing for the expected Israeli retaliation. And Iran has sort of been responding to these circumstances and these threats in sort of a multidimensional way. On one hand, there are these concerns that Iran has about some Arab states potentially assisting the U.S. and/or Israel in what might be a military operation that targets the Iranian homeland or Iranian interests throughout the region. When it comes to the GCC states, the two main concerns in this respect would be that some of the Gulf states permit the Israeli fighter jets to use their airspace, or that some U.S. military bases in the Gulf could be used for such an operation. So the Iranians have been very clear to the 6 GCC states that if there is any sort of cooperation between them and the U.S.-Israeli alliance against Iran in some upcoming attack, that Iran will make them pay a very, very high price. And the Iranians in the past, as we know, we discussed on the show before, back in September 2019, there was the huge attack on the Saudi Aramco facilities. So everyone in the Gulf remembers that episode. Everyone in the GCC knows how easy it would be for Iran and its allies to target the energy infrastructure of the GCC countries. Their economies are totally dependent on oil and gas. So the Iranians know where the GCC states are vulnerable, and they've made it very clear that any cooperation between a GCC country and Israel or the U.S. in such an act of retaliation would come with serious consequences. But at the same time, in recent years, we've seen even the most anti-Iranian members of the GCC, chiefly Saudi Arabia, make huge progress in terms of improving and warming their relations with Iran. So at the same time, the Iranian message to Saudi Arabia and others in the GCC is that if you respect our interests, we will also respect your interests. And we are very interested in continuing to improve our relations, but that obviously requires not doing anything to assist the Americans or Israelis in some sort of a military operation against Iran. And in sort of a grander context too, I think Iran is trying now more than ever to push for a de-escalation of the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon. And in that context, we saw the Iranian foreign minister visit Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So 6 Arab states this month. And I think this is about sort of rallying more regional support in favor of ceasefire both in Gaza and Lebanon. The Iranians definitely do not want these conflicts to continue and to further regionalize and internationalize for Iran's own interests.
I mean, definitely, I think a lot of people have their eye on the GCC states and have for this entire year. And there's been a lot of outrage and anger that they haven't done more, and questions of, okay, they have all this oil. Why haven't they leveraged it? They have these U.S. bases that they host. Why haven't they leveraged their willingness to host them? So why do you think the GCC states have been so reluctant to use their leverage to basically get the U.S. to rein in the Israelis? And then maybe I should be asking the question is, do they even have the leverage that we think they do?
Well, the GCC states have different perspectives on questions about Israeli normalization. The different members of the GCC have different perspectives on groups in the axis of resistance. For example, Qatar and UAE have very different perspectives on Hamas. So they obviously have their own unique interests, but what they all have in common is a whole host of concerns about what will happen to the region if the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon continue, not only in Gaza and Lebanon, but if they further regionalize into the Red Sea, Yemen, elsewhere in the Middle East. So they have been very frustrated with the United States for not using its leverage over Israel to sort of pull the plug on the Netanyahu government and get these conflicts to wind down. This is a huge source of frustration among all of the Arab states in the Gulf, and it is changing the ways in which they look at U.S. leadership on the international stage. The issue, though, getting to your question, is that they don't have the leverage to either rein in the United States or Israel, and they find themselves rather vulnerable to these dynamics. At the same time, all 6 GCC members, at the end of the day, do rely on the United States as their security guarantor, and therefore, like I said, there's a real limit as to how much influence they have, but they nonetheless remain very vulnerable to these intensifying conflict dynamics in the region.
I'm glad you raised the point about, the U.S. being sort of the bottom line security guarantor. And I guess it just makes me wonder, it's picking up on a theme you raised earlier, the Saudi-Iran rapprochement that's been developing over time, that China has been developing how real is that? Do you think the momentum towards that is moving closer? And is perhaps the desire to be less dependent on others outside the region in terms of security something behind the Saudi desire to sort of bridge this gap?
The fact that over a year has gone by since October 7th, 2023, and the Saudi-Iran detente is still on track really underscores the extent to which both Riyadh and Tehran have vested interests in maintaining this better relationship. Obviously, there's still a tremendous amount of distrust between the Saudi and Iranian governments, but they both, even if for different reasons, they both have an interest in preventing the relationship from being hostile. The Iranians, for their part, sort of accept that the US sanctions, the European sanctions, are probably going to remain in place for a long time. So, to counter the effects of Western pressure, Tehran has really invested in this foreign policy strategy called Neighbors First, which entails improving ties with all of Iran's neighbors, including Saudi Arabia and other Arab states in the neighborhood. Saudi Arabia is really focused on its own economic development and diversification at home, and of course, conflicts that involve Iran and potential Iranian-backed operations against Saudi Arabia can undermine the Saudi leadership's vision for developing the kingdom. So, for these reasons, they want to maintain the normalization of relations and really mitigate and control the tensions. It was really remarkable. 2 days after the ballistic missile attack that Iran carried out against Israel, the Iranian president and Saudi foreign minister met in Doha, and the Saudi official made it very clear. In his own words, he basically said, "We want to take the remaining issues of tension between our two countries and resolve them and start a new chapter based on brotherly relations." What I think we need to sort of take away from the past 19 months, 20 months or so of detente is that the Saudis realized that the U.S. pressure on Iran was not making the kingdom any more secure, and that ultimately for Saudi Arabia to feel more secure in relation to what Riyadh perceives as the Iranian threat, you get there through dialogue and cooperation and diplomacy, not pressure, not confrontation.
It does seem to be, when you think about what's actually taking place in the region, all we ever hear about is Iran's malign influence, Iran's malign influence. But when you actually look at who's doing what, the destruction is coming from really one side. But I wanna turn for a moment to Turkey, Giorgio, because Turkey has had harsh words for Israel, very strong words against Israel since all this started. But everyone always makes the point that these words don't mean a lot because Erdogan still maintains relations with the Israelis. Do you think that this might change as this escalates? And also, I could add to that, perhaps Turkey might even see some opportunities here. I know there's a lot of speculation from people in the region that, given that Israel's on what it perceives to be a winning streak, perhaps Syria would be in the crosshairs. And, all those rebel groups will be reactivated, which is something that Turkey played a pretty big role in helping with. So, where do you see Turkey going from here with regard to the genocide in Gaza, the escalating war on Lebanon, escalation with Iran, and potential to kind of re-destroy Syria?
Well, it's always important to consider the role that Turkey plays in the region, being an influential Muslim country, also a member of NATO, and a country that has very deep economic relations with the Arab states, Israel, and European states. So I think to answer this question, it's important to realize that since the current party ruling Turkey, the AKP, has been in power, there have definitely been previous episodes in which tensions between Ankara and Tel Aviv got quite nasty. I'm sure all your viewers remember the flotilla incident of 2010. And during those previous episodes, there was very harsh rhetoric from Erdogan and others in the Turkish leadership. But aside from the rhetoric, there were always deep economic relations between Israel and Turkey that proved resilient. So we always had to distinguish between sort of political statements and then the economics of the bilateral relationship. Earlier this year, Turkey announced a trade embargo on Israel, which seemed to suggest that this current crisis in bilateral relations was playing out differently. I have no doubt that the trade between the two countries has taken a huge hit, and the embargo should not be dismissed as totally insignificant. But I'll caveat that with 2 points. One is there is trade that still continues. It just goes through other countries such as Greece. This is something that a number of media outlets have documented, and there are some youth groups, some pro-Palestine groups in Turkey that have spoken about the fact that trade is still going on through, Greek ports. And then also at the same time, there's the factor of Azerbaijani energy that we need to keep in mind. Azerbaijan and Israel have a very close relationship going back to the 1990s, right after the Soviet Union imploded. And Israel has depended very much on Azerbaijan's hydrocarbon exports. And I believe that when this year began, the Israelis sourced 20% of their oil imports from Azerbaijan. And at some point this year, that number jumped up to 40. Point being, Israel and its war machine have very much depended on Azerbaijani oil. That oil, as we all know, there's no border between Israel and Azerbaijan. That oil goes from Azerbaijan through Georgia, through Turkey, and then through the Mediterranean to Haifa. The Turkish government could cut off that flow if it wanted to. The thing is, Turkey and Azerbaijan have a very, very close alliance. There are few alliances in the world as close as the one between Ankara and Baku. And I think the reason why, at least one of the reasons why, the leadership in Turkey has not cut off that flow of Azerbaijani oil to Israel is because that would have a very negative impact on Azerbaijan's economy. That being said, there is a lot of pressure, sort of bottom-up pressure from different groups and individuals in Turkey who are saying it's very shameful that we allow this oil to come through our country into Israel, and we have the leverage to cut it off. And there is a growing push on the Turkish leadership to do so. The longer the genocide goes on in Gaza, I think that pressure is going to intensify. I'm not necessarily predicting that it's going to result in Ankara making that move, which would be very significant. But again, point being, there's going to be more pressure from the Turkish citizens on the leadership in Turkey to do that. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Oh,
You helping us
Eugene's
sort.
muted. Oh, never mind. I can hear you now. You were muted
Sorry.
for a
Well,
minute, Eugene.
thank you. I appreciate that. I can't even unmute myself. Anyway, Giorgio, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here to sort through it all. Thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Good to be with you.